What happened to the fantasy genre? If you're active on social media, then chances are you've come across a certain type of AI-generated video with soft lighting, mystical settings, eerie music, unnaturally beautiful people, and an overall vibe that feels like it came straight out of a dream. Or maybe a nightmare? These videos, which are often referred to as dark fantasy, aren't just another TikTok trend. They point to this growing sentiment that Hollywood doesn't seem to have picked up on yet, that audiences are desperate for real movie magic. Historically, during periods of hardship, movie theaters have served as a much-needed escape. I mean, they practically got us through the Great Depression. And I'd argue that now, more than ever, people need stories that can help them forget their troubles and woes. Like every aspect of pop culture, the film industry is deeply influenced by the world around us, with different genres rising and falling in popularity depending on the social and political climate. And fantasy is no exception. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the evolution of fantasy in film, including the genre's most notable examples, the historical circumstances that influenced its direction, key characteristics that made it unique, and the way that audiences' enduring love for magic, myths, and make-believe have kept it alive. Let's get into it. Hollywood has been dipping its toes in the fantasy realm since the inception of film, but because of the technological limitations of the era, it was never able to surpass action-adventure stories or romantic comedies in terms of popularity. In the 1930s, movies featuring monstrous characters like Dracula, King Kong, and Frankenstein were all the rage, signifying a greater acceptance and interest in these sorts of fictional stories. But because of the Great Depression, which ushered in an era of uncertainty, lighthearted fantasy remained a rare sight until the end of the decade. Two of the earliest examples were 1937's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and 1939's The Wizard of Oz, which wound up becoming some of the most popular and influential films of all time. But considering their incredibly high production values, studios weren't fully sold on the idea of fantasy. The 1940s started off with a bang with The Thief of Baghdad and Fantasia, and with their breathtaking visuals and surreal artistry, these fantasy films helped create a lasting association between magic and color. Although there was clearly demand for these sorts of fantasy films, World War II put a screeching halt to the development of the genre, with the color process being deemed too costly and the subject matter inappropriate considering the political climate. This eventually led to the rise of the black and white film noir genre instead, which appealed to the cynical mindset that had emerged because of the war. After the war ended, fantasy films were pushed into production as a celebration that the worst was over, and throughout the 1950s and 60s, Hollywood released an assortment of movies inspired by ancient myths, folktales, legends, and fairy tales like Sinbad the Sailor, The Tales of Hoffmann, Darby O'Gill and the Little People, Arabian Nights, Hercules, Babes in Toyland, The Glass Slipper, The Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm, and Sleeping Beauty. Legendary child actress Shirley Temple even hosted a popular TV series focused on different fairy tales, proving that the American public's fondness for these sorts of stories wasn't a fluke. In the aftermath of World War II, the United States and the USSR began to battle over their respective ideologies, resulting in the Cold War. This divided the two superpowers' allies into separate camps, the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc, with the countries in the latter being restricted by censors and communist guidelines. There was a big emphasis to resist American ideologies and remain true to their own traditions, and with foreign films often being banned entirely, there was a resurgence in classic folktales and legends. These fantasy films would often have an undercurrent of communist messaging, with the storylines featuring a greedy and egotistical villain who makes the lives of others miserable, only to be defeated by a selfless hero who has an endless love and respect for their homeland and family. This included the likes of The Princess with the Golden Star, The Tale of Sar Sultan, There Was Once a King, Snow White and Rose Red, Kingdom in the Clouds, and Jack Frost. Fantasy films in both the Eastern and Western Bloc had similar visuals at this time, with colorful scenery, elaborate sets, fun costuming, angelic-looking protagonists, and entertaining musical numbers, which created an overall magical look. These films also featured many staples of the fantasy genre, including knights in shining armor, wicked stepmothers, foolish kings, animal transformations, beautiful but mistreated maidens, and a morally ambiguous magical entity who would set the story in motion. For most of the 1940s, well into the 1960s, the Motion Picture Production Code, aka the Hays Code, had dictated what sorts of films were allowed to be made in Hollywood, with everything from the story to the actors to the visuals having to follow these guidelines. This is what led to the popularity of the rom-com and musical during that time period, as they were one of the few genres guaranteed to make it through the censor every single time. With the Hays Code finally being abolished in the 1970s, filmmakers were allowed to take greater risks, and in contrast to the glitz and glamour of prior decades, films went in a gritty and pessimistic direction influenced by the Vietnam War. The sort of theatricality that had defined old Hollywood, like musical numbers and technicolor and transatlantic accents, were seen as old-fashioned, and as a result the fantasy genre fell by the wayside in favor of family dramas, crime thrillers, and gory horror. In Europe, however, fantasy films continued to thrive, in large part because the political turmoil of the 1970s had resulted in people yearning for a simpler time. Many filmmakers began turning to the fairy tales that had brought them joy in their youth, like Donkey Skin, Beauty and the Beast, Three Wishes for Cinderella, and The Adventures of Pinocchio, which took visual cues from earlier decades. With many countries in the Eastern Bloc attempting uprisings, but failing, these fantasy films featured less communist propaganda than they had in earlier years, highlighting their discontent with Soviet control and their hope to someday have a happily ever after. The Conan the Barbarian comic series had grown in popularity over the course of the 1970s, and by the 1980s, several knockoffs had spawned, including The First Kingdom, Dagar the Invincible, Beowulf Dragonslayer, Warlord, and Claw the Unconquered. Dungeons & Dragons had also developed a sizable audience, and combined with the enduring popularity of The Lord of the Rings, the public's interest in fantasy inspired Hollywood to give the genre another shot. With the 1980s being all about excess, leading to an increased extravagance in every aspect of pop culture, films of the time period became more of a spectacle, featuring larger set pieces, bigger stars, and a lot more action. Some of the first fantasy films to be released during this era were Hawk the Slayer in 1980, and Dragon Slayer, The Archer, Excalibur, and Clash of the Titans in 1981. Seeing varying degrees of critical and commercial success, these movies had some crucial overlap that would come to define fantasy of the decade. In 1982, The Sword and the Sorcerer and Conan the Barbarian were released, and with both thriving at the box office, Hollywood went all in on fantasy. The sword and sorcery subgenre became especially popular at this time, although I'd make the argument that if you'd seen one, you'd seen them all. These films would usually follow a morally gray warrior whose physical strength was their only weapon. Accompanied by a small group of allies, they would set off on an adventure to seek vengeance on some magic-wielding villain. In most cases, the protagonist would be an incredibly macho man, while the female characters were nothing but scantily clad set dressing. While there were some visual similarities to fantasy films of the past, I always found it interesting how the sword and sorcery genre was clearly influenced by the 1980s rock and wrestling craze, with the characters looking like medieval versions of WWE performers, complete with oiled-up biceps, shiny spandex, and over-choreographed battle sequences. Notable examples of the trend included the Beastmaster, Red Sonja, Masters of the Universe, Conquest, Hercules, Heavy Metal, Deathstalker, the Warrior and the Sorceress, and Ator the Fighting Eagle, which is honestly just the tip of the iceberg. While the genre initially saw a lot of interest, it quickly developed a less than positive reputation because of its hammy acting, formulaic storylines, and seemingly low budget, and by the end of the decade it had fizzled out entirely. In contrast were more traditional fantasy films like The Never-Ending Story, Legend, The Princess Bride, Labyrinth, Willow, Sword of the Valiant, The Dark Crystal, and Ladyhawke. Common plot points included damsels in distress, mythical creatures, dashing heroes, nervous adolescents, grand quests, and battles between good and evil. While these films incorporated bright colors, stunning backdrops, and a good deal of sparkles, they also mixed in some slightly darker imagery, like muddy swamps, oversized rats, and absolutely terrifying villains. While the settings were as fantastical as the storylines, they'd usually be rooted in some vaguely historical context, like the Stone Age, ancient Greece, or the medieval era, time periods that had fascinated the public for centuries. They also had a habit of combining practical effects with experimental visual effects, creating an aesthetic that was artificial and uncanny, but also beautiful and mesmerizing. The darker direction fantasy took in the 1980s was even present in animation, with films like The Black Cauldron, The Secret of NIMH, The Last Unicorn, Happily Ever After, and The Flight of Dragons. But unfortunately, many of them didn't perform very well at the box office, something I blame on the growing idea that animation was just for kids, which is why many of the animated fantasy films of the 1990s, like Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, Hercules, The Page Master, The Swan Princess, and Thumbelina, were a lot more lighthearted. For most of the fantasy genre's history, Filmmakers had gone in a more theatrical direction to tie into the absurdity of the premise, but with technological advancements of the 1990s allowing for cameras to move off sound stages and into real locations, natural visuals replaced the stylized look the genre had become known for. This meant no more loincloths, shining swords, or glowing crystal balls. While Gothic horror was thriving in the 1990s, bringing vampires and witches into the mainstream, dragons, warlocks, and fairies weren't as popular, with Dragonheart, A Tale of Terror, and A Midsummer's Night's Dream being some of the few fantasy movies from the decade that actually looked magical. The kids' space was the exception, with films like Hook, A Simple Wish, Magic in the Mirror, Fairy Tale, The Adventures of Pinocchio, Cinderella, Magic Island, and Leap and Leprechauns continuing to have the bright colors and playful imagery that made the genre so appealing to begin with. You'll notice that unlike fantasy films of the past, which would typically focus on adult characters, these films had child protagonists, which might have inadvertently solidified the idea that fantasy stories were more juvenile. Now, there was one thing that was a vast improvement from the 1980s. With third-wave feminism challenging traditional gender roles, female characters were no longer relegated to being the sexy sidekick, but could actually be a major protagonist or antagonist. Just think about Matilda, Merlin, Anastasia, or Xena Warrior Princess, with the latter being a far cry from the sword and sorcery sex kittens that inspired her. What was great about this more feminist direction was that they didn't totally throw the male characters under the bus. It was about giving all of the characters strengths and weaknesses. In the 2000s, the fantasy genre exploded, something credited to the success of the Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings film series. Family-friendly fantasy was a big thing at the time, and brought in billions of dollars, and studios made sure there was enough action for dad, romance for mom, and magic for the kids. With the Scholastic Book Fair turning a generation of children into voracious readers, Hollywood made a point of adapting popular fantasy books into films, including the Spiderwick Chronicles, Inkheart, Arthur and the Invisibles, The Chronicles of Narnia, Aragon, The Golden Compass, Nanny McPhee, Peter Pan, and Ella Enchanted. Of course, some of these adaptations fared better than others. Some darker fantasy stories intended for older audiences included The Brothers Grimm, The Fall, The Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus, Stardust, and Pan's Labyrinth, which were loosely inspired by a variety of classic legends and folklore. You can really tell that Hollywood had more money than they knew what to do with. So while CGI became a lot more prominent than it had in other eras, they still had fun with prosthetics, practical effects, and sound stages. While I don't think there's a lot of visual overlap with fantasy films of the 1980s or 1950s, the 2000s were still able to capture the magic and whimsy that makes the genre so inviting. Because of the popularity of the superhero genre, action-adventure became an inescapable addition to fantasy in the 2010s, with films like Alice in Wonderland, Hansel and Gretel Witch Hunters, Maleficent, Pan, The Nutcracker in the Four Realms, and Jack the Giant Slayer putting a larger emphasis on fighting the bad guy than their original fairy tale. Not to mention that with the popularity of the YA genre, especially The Hunger Games and Twilight, a lot of tropes popular in that space began finding their way into fantasy. Films like Red Riding Hood, Snow White and the Huntsman, Percy Jackson and the Olympians, The Mortal Instruments, and Beautiful Creatures epitomized this subgenre and included love triangles, family secrets, chosen one narratives, and adolescent angst. Now, did I eat it up every single time? Absolutely. But in hindsight, it was pretty obvious that Hollywood was just cashing in on a craze. With CGI fully eclipsing practical effects by this point, a lot of these movies wound up looking overproduced, with a glossy sheen that almost veered into uncanny valley territory. I truly think there's no better example of how much the visuals in fantasy had deteriorated than by comparing the 1981 Clash of the Titans film to its 2010 remake, or 2013's Oz the Great and Powerful compared to 1939's Wizard of Oz. You can just tell that everyone is walking around in front of a green screen and interacting with things that aren't actually there. Fourth wave feminism had a huge impact on female characters in the 2010s and 2020s, with there being a bigger focus on women's empowerment and independence than in previous decades. In theory, I have no complaints, but unfortunately in practice, it often came across as performative. Instead of creating interesting characters with nuanced motivations and realistic growth, something they'd done pretty well in the 1990s, the fantasy genre was soon overrun by dozens of generic girl bosses. Just look at the main characters in Cursed, The Princess, and Damsel, who not only have eerily similar personalities, but even look the same. To make matters worse, the vast majority of fantasy films that have been released in recent years have just been live-action remakes of far superior animated movies, and I don't know why these companies are continuing to churn them out when they've been such massive critical and commercial disappointments. Sure, in the grand scheme of things, movies might not seem like a huge deal, not when we're facing trade wars, global warming, and a long list of other crises. But as we've seen time and time again, fantasy has always been more than just entertainment. It's a way for us to imagine a better, brighter future, one that might even have a little bit of magic in it. That's exactly why I think people are so drawn to these AI-generated dark fantasy videos. Visually, they rely heavily on the fantasy aesthetics of the 1950s and 1980s, hence all the romantic lighting, strange creatures, and dreamlike landscapes. But there's also a darker, more sinister undertone that feels perfectly aligned with the relatively bleak reality that we're living through. Considering how popular these videos are, it's clear that there's still an appetite for fantasy stories, which begs the question, why isn't Hollywood making movies like this anymore? What happened to creativity? Instead of continuing the wave of glossy, CGI-heavy, desaturated blockbusters, I'd love to see a return to something a little more theatrical and magical. And don't tell me that it's not possible. The Love Witch came out in 2016, and it could fool anyone into thinking it was made in the 1960s. There are hundreds of legends from all over the world that haven't been adapted to film yet. Why not try some of them out? And I know that Disney acts like they have dibs on all fairy tales, but considering they've been refusing to put a modicum of effort into it, I'd rather someone else give it a try. In the meantime, I'm gonna keep wishing for the return of movie magic, cause Lord knows we could all use a little more of it. I hope you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!